A contract is a legally binding agreement between two or more parties. It is not enough to state that a contract is an agreement. It is important to point out that a contract is a legally binding agreement. This is because all contracts are agreements, but not all agreements are contracts. It is the legally binding aspect of an agreement which makes it a contract in English law. So what do I mean by legally binding? I mean that if an agreement is legally binding, if one party fails to do what they promised to do under the agreement, the other party has the right to ask the court to enforce that promise. Whereas with a non-legally binding agreement, just an ordinary agreement, because it is not a contract in English law, if one party fails to do what they promised to do, we don't have a right to ask the court to enforce that agreement. Let's have a look at two examples of agreements. One will be a non-legally binding agreement, and one will be a legally binding agreement or contract in English law. And hopefully this will help us to understand exactly what the difference is between the two. So in scenario A, we meet Laura and Robert. Robert had been unwell for quite some time. And as Laura is such a wonderful friend, she decided that she would make an offer to Robert. And the offer said, "Oh, Robert, I will clean your flat for 4 weeks. I will come to clean your flat every Friday for the next 4 weeks." Robert agreed. He said, "Oh, thank you, Laura. Thank you so much. You're very kind." Laura started going to clean his flat immediately, and she went for 3 weeks. On the third week, she began to feel a bit frustrated with Robert because Robert was quite messy. And Laura decided she wouldn't go back to clean his flat on the following week. So on the fourth week, she didn't go back to clean his flat. Now remember, these two had an agreement. But now that Laura is not cleaning Robert's flat anymore, does Robert have a right to go to the court to ask the court to get Laura to clean his flat? Was their agreement legally binding? No, this is a non-legally binding agreement. There are certain elements missing from this agreement which make it a non-legally binding agreement. It is not a legally binding agreement or contract in English law. Now let's turn to scenario B. In scenario B, we meet Jane and Mark. Jane and Mark had recently got married, and they found themselves a nice little home with a big problem. The big problem was their kitchen. Their kitchen was unusable. They needed a brand new one, and they only had £3,000 to get this work done. They searched and searched and searched. Most of the people they found said they would do the work for between £5,000 and £10,000. Eventually, they found someone called Keith, and Keith ran a company called Keith's Kitchens. Keith said, "If you will pay me £3,000 in advance, I will get this kitchen done for you." He said, "Normally I would charge about £5,000 to £6,000 to get this type of work done. But you're a newlywed couple and I totally understand. So I will just charge you £3,000, but you need to pay me in advance." Jane and Mark paid Keith £3,000 to get the work done. Keith turned up and worked for 10 days straight. But on the 11th day, he did not turn up. He called Jane and Mark and he told them that his back was in a state and that he would need to be off from work for a week. They waited for 7 days, and after 7 days, Keith did not turn up to work again. So they decided to call him. And Keith said, "I'm really sorry, but I'm in hospital and I'm not going to be able to work for the next 6 months. But I do have someone who can come and do the work for you. And his name is Rory. He'll be with you tomorrow." And Rory did turn up. Rory turned up the following day and he worked the whole day, but he complained the whole day. He said the work was far more than Keith had told him, and he wasn't sure if he was going to come back after that. And Rory didn't turn up after that. After 3 days of waiting and not seeing Rory nor Keith, nor hearing from Keith, Jane and Mark decided to call Keith. But when they called Keith, they realized his phone had been disconnected. They were unable to get through to Keith. If Jane and Mark were to turn to the law to get their money back or to get the job done, would they be able to do so? Do they have a legally binding agreement with Keith's Kitchens? Yes, they do. There are particular elements present in the agreement between Jane and Mark and Keith's Kitchens which make it a legally binding agreement or contract in English law. Those elements are a legally binding offer, acceptance, consideration, and intention to create legal relations. Later on in the course, we will explore exactly what these elements are and how we identify them in English law.